The sun hung lazily in the sky, casting golden streaks over the quiet suburban street, the kind of peace that made a day off feel like a luxury. Mark Reynolds, the police chief, had just wiped the grease from his hands, admiring the gleam of his restored classic Mustang when the shrill, self-righteous voice of doom arrived at his garage door. He barely had time to register the interruption before she spoke, her presence cutting through the air like an unsanctioned city ordinance. "You can't do that here." Mark turned, finding himself face to face with Karen Dawson, the neighborhood's self-appointed enforcer of things that weren't her business. She stood rigid, arms crossed so tightly he wondered if she was preventing her own circulation, her lips pursed in a way that suggested she had sucked on a lemon moments before. He had seen this woman before, mostly from a distance, at HOA meetings where she railed against everything from overgrown lawns to the existential threat of wind chimes. He exhaled, already sensing that his peaceful afternoon was about to be steamrolled by the bureaucratic hurricane that was Karen. He forced a neutral expression. "Do what?" Karen huffed, gesturing dramatically at his garage. "This. All of this. The constant noise, the traffic, She leaned forward, sniffing the fumes. "It's completely unacceptable." Mark blinked, glancing behind him at his open garage, where nothing but his Mustang, some tools, and a half-drunk cup of coffee sat in plain view. "You mean me working on my car?" Karen's eyes narrowed, her tone sharpening. "I know what's going on here. You think you're being clever, but I've seen the cars coming and going all week. This isn't just a hobby. This is an illegal auto shop, and you're disturbing the neighborhood." A laugh nearly escaped Mark, but he swallowed it down. "Karen, I can promise you, there's no business here. Just me, my car, and a few friends who stop by to talk shop." Karen's expression darkened, the way a storm cloud looms before lightning strikes. "Don't try to gaslight me. I know when something's fishy. I've already reported this to the HOA, and if you don't shut this down, I'll take it to the next level." Mark tilted his head, amusement creeping in despite himself. "And what level would that be?" Karen squared her shoulders. "The law." For a moment, silence stretched between them, the absurdity of the statement settling like dust in the air. She really thought she was delivering a fatal blow, the kind of threat that would send a mere mortal into trembling compliance. But Mark wasn't just any neighbor. He was the police chief. He studied her for a second, wondering just how deep she was willing to dig this hole for herself. "I see," he said finally. "And what exactly do you think the law is going to do?" Karen sniffed. "They'll shut you down." Mark was about to respond when she whipped out her phone and, with a flourish, began dialing. "Oh, you're actually calling," he muttered, mostly to himself. She raised a hand as if silencing him. "Yes, I'd like to report an illegal business operating out of a residential home." Her voice turned syrupy with self-importance, her free hand now resting on her hip. "It's a garage. Cars coming in and out all the time, completely against zoning laws." She paused, then smirked. "Yes, I'll wait." Mark folded his arms, settling against the frame of his garage as he watched her. He knew exactly where this was going, but sometimes it was best to let the train wreck unfold in real time. It didn't take long. 10 minutes later, sirens whined in the distance, and a police cruiser rolled onto the quiet street, lights flashing as if responding to an actual emergency. Mark exhaled through his nose, shaking his head as the car came to a stop in front of his driveway. Karen stood triumphantly beside him, her arms crossed again, satisfaction radiating off her like she had just orchestrated a citizen's arrest. The driver's door opened, and out stepped Officer Davis, a young cop with the kind of nervous energy that suggested he was still trying to figure out how to navigate absurd calls like this. His partner, Officer Taylor, followed, both looking mildly confused as they approached. Davis cleared his throat, glancing at his notepad. "Sir, we received a report about an unlicensed business being run out of this address." Before Mark could respond, Karen jumped in. "Yes. He's been fixing cars, making money under the table, disrupting the entire neighborhood. It's illegal, and I demand something be done. Officer Davis frowned slightly. Right. Sir, do you have any documentation related to vehicle repairs or a business license? Mark watched them carefully, suppressing the grin that threatened to surface. You want identification? He asked, reaching into his back pocket. Davis nodded. Yes, sir. Mark pulled out his wallet, flipped it open, and extended it toward them, revealing the gleaming badge inside. Sure thing, officer. Here's my ID. The shift in Davis's expression was immediate. His eyes widened as he processed the name on the badge, his mouth parting slightly. Taylor stiffened beside him, clearly coming to the same realization. Karen, on the other hand, remained blissfully unaware, her confidence unwavering. Davis swallowed. Chief Reynolds? Karen's head snapped toward Mark so fast he thought she might get whiplash. Mark raised an eyebrow. That's right. Silence fell like a hammer. Karen's smug expression flickered, confusion overtaking her features. Wait, you're a cop? Mark tilted his head. Not just a cop, Karen. The police chief. For a moment, Karen's mouth worked without sound, her brain visibly trying to reboot. Davis, now looking somewhere between mortified and deeply regretful, exchanged a glance with Taylor. Karen took a step back. But that doesn't mean you're above the law. Mark exhaled, nodding. Absolutely. That's why I'm happy to let these fine officers take a look at my garage. No business license. No invoices. No customers. Just me, my car, and an unfortunate interruption to my day off. Davis hesitated, but Karen, desperate now, insisted, You still need to check. He's hiding something. Taylor, who had remained silent until now, sighed. Ma'am, the chief just showed us his badge. This is clearly not an illegal business. Karen's face reddened. You're just taking his side because he's your boss. Davis exhaled slowly, rubbing the bridge of his nose. Ma'am, you do realize that making a false police report is, in fact, a crime, right? Karen's face drained of color. Mark finally let his grin surface. Now, Karen, let's see just how deep this rabbit hole goes. Karen's stunned silence was the kind of moment Mark wished he had recorded. Her mouth opened and closed as if trying to summon an argument from the depths of her self-righteous indignation, but for the first time, words failed her. Officer Davis, now realizing the absolute mess he had just walked into, shifted uncomfortably, his notepad practically useless in his hand. His partner, Officer Taylor, looked equally unsure of how to proceed, his eyes darting between Karen and Mark as if debating whether to pretend this entire situation wasn't happening. But Karen, never one to admit defeat, recovered faster than expected. She squared her shoulders, nostrils flaring, the righteous fury returning to her face like a storm that refused to clear. So what if you're the police chief? She said, her voice a mixture of disbelief and misplaced confidence. That doesn't mean you can just ignore the law. If you're running a business out of your garage, that's still illegal. There are zoning rules in this neighborhood, and you have to follow them just like everyone else. Mark sighed, rubbing his temple, wondering if she genuinely believed what she was saying or if she was just doubling down out of sheer stubbornness. Karen, for the last time, I'm not running a business. I was working on my own car. That's not against the law. He gestured toward the garage, where the unmistakable lack of a cash register, customer invoices, or any sign of a functioning business should have been enough to end the argument. You're welcome to look around, officers. You won't find anything but a guy trying to enjoy his weekend. Officer Davis hesitated, then gave a small nod. Let's just take a look to be thorough. He and Taylor stepped into the garage, their eyes scanning the space, flipping through a few papers on the workbench. After a minute, Davis exhaled. Yeah, Chief, this just looks like a personal project. There's no sign of a business here. Karen's eyes twitched, frustration simmering just beneath the surface. Of course you wouldn't find anything. He probably hid everything before you got here. You need to check his records, see if he's been making money under the table. People have been coming and going from his house all week. Mark chuckled, crossing his arms. You mean my friends? The ones who stop by to talk cars, drink beer, and occasionally help me lift an engine block? Yeah, Karen, definitely sounds like an underground criminal enterprise. Karen's face reddened further, but before she could launch into another tirade, Officer Davis cleared his throat, looking less amused by the second. Ma'am, unless you have actual evidence of illegal activity, we can't just start investigating someone based on suspicions. Karen's voice pitched higher. So you're just going to let him get away with it? Davis sighed. Get away with what, exactly? With whatever he's doing. He could be committing fraud. He could be. Or he could just be fixing his car, Taylor interjected, his patience clearly wearing thin. Which, again, is not illegal. Karen sputtered, struggling to maintain her footing in the argument, but her confidence had started to crack. It wasn't often that people pushed back against her nonsense, at least not in a way she couldn't bulldoze through. She turned back to Mark, her eyes narrowing. Just because you're the police chief doesn't mean you're above the law. Mark gave her a slow nod. And just because you don't like something doesn't make it illegal. For a moment, the street was silent, neighbors peeking through blinds or pretending to walk their dogs just a little slower, ears undoubtedly straining to catch every word. The neighborhood had seen Karen throw fits before, over noise, over decorations, over a kid's lemonade stand that she claimed was operating without a permit. But this? This was something new, something worth watching. Davis, likely sensing that this was going to spiral further if he didn't put a stop to it, took a deep breath and pulled out his notepad. Ma'am, I have to inform you that making a false police report is a crime. You accuse Chief Reynolds of running an illegal business, and we've found no evidence of that. That means you knowingly wasted police resources? Karen's face paled slightly. I didn't file a report. I just called it in. Taylor sighed. That still counts. You made a false accusation, and we had to respond to it? Karen took a step back, shaking her head. This is ridiculous. I was just trying to look out for the neighborhood. Davis gave her a flat look. By calling the cops on the police chief? Karen turned, searching for support from the onlookers, but the neighbors who had been casually eavesdropping quickly found reasons to look elsewhere. She was alone in this, and she knew it. Her hands clenched at her sides. This isn't fair. I was just doing my duty as a citizen. Mark smirked. You know, Karen, for someone so concerned about rules, you sure don't seem to know them very well. She opened her mouth to retort, but Davis cut in. We're officially warning you. If you continue making false reports, you could be fined or worse. Karen's breath hitched. Fined? Taylor nodded. Yeah, ma'am. You've made multiple nuisance complaints before. This isn't the first time you've called about something ridiculous. He glanced at his partner. Run her address through the system. Karen's face twisted. This is harassment. Davis ignored her, tapping into his patrol car's tablet. A few moments later, he let out a low whistle. Well, you've called in a lot of complaints over the years. Mark raised an eyebrow. Anything good? Taylor read over his shoulder. Let's see, complaints about kids playing outside too loudly, a suspiciously shaped mailbox, wind chimes being disruptive. Oh, and my favorite, Halloween decorations being a public safety hazard. Karen's jaw clenched. Those were legitimate concerns. Mark couldn't hold back his laughter. A suspicious mailbox? Karen threw up her hands. It was black instead of the standard white. How was I supposed to know it wasn't hiding something? Taylor gave her a look of pure exhaustion. Ma'am, you're aware that wasting emergency resources is a real issue, right? Karen scoffed. I'm not wasting anything. I'm keeping this neighborhood safe. Davis shook his head, closing his notepad. Ma'am, consider this your official warning. If you do this again, you're facing consequences. Karen's mouth opened and closed, her face a deep shade of red. This isn't over, she muttered before spinning on her heel and storming off, slamming her front door so hard that a nearby bird took off in terror. Mark exhaled, shaking his head as he turned back to the officers. "Well, that was entertaining." Davis chuckled, rubbing his forehead. "Chief, I gotta be honest, I did not expect to be dealing with something like this today." Mark grinned. "Welcome to the neighborhood." Taylor sighed. "I'd ask if this kind of thing happens often, but I feel like I already know the answer." Mark gestured toward Karen's house. "Oh, this? This was nothing. Wait till she tries to ban Christmas lights." Davis groaned. "I think I need a coffee." Mark smirked. "Next time you guys get called here, bring me one too." As the patrol car pulled away, the last remnants of the absurdity fading into the background, Mark stretched, turning back toward his garage. The neighborhood might have quieted down for now, but he had no doubt Karen wasn't done. The morning after the fiasco, Mark Reynolds stepped outside with his coffee, expecting the usual neighborhood calm, but instead, he was greeted by an unexpected sight. Karen's house, the well-maintained fortress of petty complaints and self-righteous rule enforcement, had become the new epicenter of attention. Someone had placed a fake parking ticket under her windshield wiper with bold letters stating, "For wasting police time." A plastic toy police badge had been taped to her mailbox with a handwritten note that read, "Congratulations, Karen. You're now an honorary officer of the Neighborhood Nuisance Patrol." But the crowning jewel of it all was a small yard sign that had mysteriously appeared overnight, stuck into her pristine lawn with perfect precision. It read in bold capital letters, "Neighborhood Watch. Keeping an eye on Karen." Mark nearly choked on his coffee as he processed the scene, his shoulders shaking with silent laughter. Whoever had done this wasn't just making a statement, they were making an artistic masterpiece of mockery. It didn't take long before the front door burst open, and Karen stormed out like a tornado ready to flatten everything in its path. Her face was a deep shade of red, a mixture of anger, embarrassment, and sheer disbelief. She marched to her car first, yanking the fake ticket off her windshield, muttering angrily under her breath. Then she snatched the toy badge from her mailbox as if it had personally insulted her entire lineage. But when she reached the sign on her lawn, she froze. Her fingers trembled around the edges of the wooden post as she yanked it from the ground, her head whipping around, scanning the street for the culprit. "Who did this?" she shrieked, holding the sign in the air like it was evidence in a courtroom trial. A few houses down, someone let out an exaggeratedly loud cough. Another neighbor suddenly became very interested in adjusting their potted plant. A jogger on the sidewalk picked up the pace. The entire street had a suspicious air of innocent whistling, as if everyone had played a hand in this but no one was about to confess. Karen's glare swept across the houses, her paranoia growing by the second. She pointed an accusatory finger in every direction, but no one met her gaze. Mark, still standing by his garage, took another sip of his coffee and called out, "Looks like the neighborhood has spoken, Karen." Karen's eyes snapped to him, her nostrils flaring. "You think this is funny?" He smiled. "Oh, I think it's hilarious." Karen stomped toward him, waving the sign like a weapon. "You put them up to this, didn't you?" Mark shook his head, still amused. "Nope. But if I had, I'd have made the sign bigger." She let out an exasperated huff, her eyes darting back to her house, probably wondering if more surprises were waiting for her. For once, Karen wasn't the one calling the shots. The realization hit her hard, evident in the way her shoulders tensed. The neighborhood, the same one she had spent years controlling through complaints, passive-aggressive emails, and HOA rule enforcement, had finally turned against her. Before she could launch into another rant, a voice called from a few houses down. "Oh, Karen's at it again." Mark turned to see Mr. Thompson, the retired veteran who had lived in the neighborhood longer than anyone, standing by his fence with a knowing grin. He took a slow sip of his coffee before adding, "You know, she called the cops on my Halloween decorations last year. Said they were too realistic." Officer Davis, who just happened to be driving by on patrol, slowed his cruiser as he passed, catching sight of the chaos. He rolled down his window, peering at Karen with a look of exasperation. "Ma'am, I'd strongly advise against another unnecessary call today." Karen's jaw clenched. "This is harassment." Mark smirked. "No, Karen, this is karma." She turned on her heel, storming back to her house, but just before she disappeared inside, she stopped and shot one final glare over her shoulder. "This isn't over." Mark chuckled, watching as her door slammed shut with enough force to make a nearby bird take off in fright. He glanced back at the neighborhood, where subtle smirks and exchanged glances made it clear that everyone was enjoying this far more than they should. The next few days were suspiciously quiet. Karen, for once, had gone silent. No complaints, no HOA emails, no thinly veiled threats about neighborhood rules. It was almost unsettling. Mark found himself wondering if she was plotting her revenge in some overly dramatic way, but as the days passed, he started to believe something else had happened. Maybe, just maybe, Karen had finally realized that she had lost control. A week later, as Mark stood in his garage once again, tuning the engine of his Mustang, he heard footsteps approaching. He turned, half expecting another round of Karen-induced nonsense, but instead, he was met with Mrs. Carter, the elderly neighbor from a few houses down, carrying a tray of freshly baked cookies. "I just wanted to say thank you," she said, offering the tray with a warm smile. Mark blinked, confused. "For what?" Mrs. Carter smirked. "For finally putting Karen in her place. She's been a nightmare for years. Calling the cops on kids playing basketball, trying to get people fined over Christmas lights, even complaining about how often I water my plants. But ever since you shut her down, she's been quiet. And we've all been sleeping a little better." Mark let out a laugh, shaking his head as he accepted a cookie. "Guess she finally learned that the law applies to everyone." Mrs. Carter leaned in slightly, lowering her voice. "You know, there's been talk of making you head of the HOA next election." Mark nearly choked on the cookie. "Oh hell no." Mrs. Carter chuckled. "Figured you'd say that." She patted his arm and walked off, leaving him standing there, still amused, still shaking his head. As he turned back to his car, the quiet hum of the neighborhood settling around him, he took a deep breath, letting the peace sink in. For the first time in a long time, things felt calm. No unnecessary police calls, no HOA complaints, no absurd neighborhood drama. It was almost too good to be true. And then, just as he reached for his wrench, a knock sounded at his open garage door. Mark sighed. "Here we go again."